Hi, my name is Tack, and I'm joined here today by Stewart. And we're going to be talking about the regional dynamic that has been coming out of the Russian involvement in the Syrian conflict. So, Scott, we've seen the Russians set up an intelligence sharing cell with the Iraqis, with the Syrians, and with the Iranians in Baghdad. How does the creation of a cell like that or the coordination that comes with it change the way that regional actors are involved in the battle against IS?
Well, I think there's two things that we have to remember. Number one, as we've said for a long time here at Stratfor, when thinking about the Islamic State, you really need to think about them across the region in both Iraq and Syria. And so since they exist in both places, you need to have intelligence pertaining to them in both places. So it really makes sense for the Russians to do that. And really the Americans haven't been able to do that with the Syrians. So we're not seeing, the American equivalent in Syria right now. But as far as the actual impact on the American relationship with the Iraqis, I don't see it having a lot of difference because let's face it, well, first of all, the Russians have already been in Iraq for over a year now. They've been providing equipment, military support, maintenance on aircraft and other weapon systems for a long time. And furthermore, we've had a heavy Iranian influence and involvement in Iraq as well. So really the Americans have had to have been careful about what they're sharing with the Iraqis to begin with because of the Iranian influence and just the way that they're pretty well tied to the Iraqi regime. So I don't see it really having a huge impact on the American-Iraqi relationship going forward.
And then other than the U.S. involvement in Iraq, of course, the Russian presence and any operations they undertake are going to have an impact on the non-IS rebel factions in Syria, and that'll pull in Turkey, Saudi Arabia. How does Russia interact with those countries? How do they manage all of those different actors and their different imperatives in Syria as they expand their role?
I'm not sure they can. Obviously they're trying to reach out. They're trying to, create their own coalition. But when we look at bottom lines and national interests, certainly they have conflicting interests with the Saudis, the Qataris, the Turks, who are, basically using and funding and arming these other rebel groups that the Russians are probably going to have to start bombing. I mean, if the Russians are serious about supporting, the Assad regime, they have to go after these other rebel groups. There's just no other way around it. Those are the groups that really pose the threat to Latakia and the Alawite homeland there. So I think that we're going to see in short order Russian attacks on those other groups.
And now, of course, you briefly mentioned the Alawite core there. The real reason for Russia to be involved here, of course, is not strictly a military protection of this core. What we expect to see is Russia bringing the Assad regime or any Syrian regime beyond Assad to the table to negotiate with the rebel forces. So how does that change the dynamics of the U.S. operations, the U.S. imperative towards Syria, where they've in the past, they've been mostly focusing on IS. Obviously, they're not huge fans of a continued Assad regime. So how does the Russian plan to bring Assad to the table modify the U.S. strategy in Syria?
I think if we think about it, the Russians have a lot more leverage on Assad than the Americans do. Other than the fact, if the Americans were to begin direct bombing of the regime. But clearly, after the red line was passed with the chemical weapons, we saw that the Americans really didn't want to repeat Libya. They didn't want to just take the regime out and result in that vacuum of authority. So they seem to recognize that there must be some sort of Alawite place at the table, and that seems also what the Russians are looking for. So the Russians actually may have the opportunity to place leverage against Assad to bring the Alawites to the table to get them to the point where they can negotiate with. One of the problems now, though, is who do they negotiate with? The rest of the rebels are so fractured, not only along jihadi lines with the Islamic State and al-Nusra and their Jabhat al-Fatah group, but even the more nationalistic Syrian groups are also fractured. So who do you negotiate at this point and the Kurds as another actor. So it's going to be very difficult to bring any sort of really coordinated nationwide, Syria-wide peace talks.
And then we've also seen the U.S. give up its efforts to fund the train and equip program, which has been a relative failure on terms of U.S. intent in Syria. So are we seeing a terribly weak position for the U.S. to actually work with those rebel factions? Can the U.S. still have a meaningful seat at the table if they are not able to bring rebel factions together to actually be a partner in negotiations with the Assad regime?
Certainly the Americans don't have a lot of leverage with those rebel groups. They've worked much closer with the Kurds than most of the Sunni factions. But really what they'll do is try to work with their regional partners, the Saudis, the Qataris, the Turks, and use them to bring those other parties to the table.
Thank you very much. Sadly, that's all we've got time for, but we'll keep tracking this issue here at Stratfor. If you would like to read more about this, please visit our website at stratfor.com.